Ever heard of an empire that conquered without an army? A kingdom whose power wasn't measured in territory seized, but in hearts and minds won. Welcome to the story of the Kingdom of Nri, one of West Africa's most unique and profound powers. For centuries, Nri didn't build its influence with swords or shields, but with something far more enduring: spiritual authority, law, and ritual. At the heart of this influence were the Nri priests, known as the Nri. These weren't warriors marching to battle. They were ambassadors of peace, traveling far and wide across the land. They carried no weapons, only sacred symbols of their divine mission. They held the Ofo, a staff representing authority and absolute truth. They carried the Akwi, a sacred drum whose rhythm was said to summon the divine presence itself. And they walked the Nri, the sacred pathways of ritual and justice that connected communities. Imagine this. Wherever these priests went, conflict ceased. Disputes that might have led to bloodshed were settled through careful mediation. Crimes weren't met with violent punishment, but with ritual cleansing, purifying the community and restoring balance. The Nri taught the laws of the land and the taboos that maintained cosmic order, not by force, but through wisdom and respect. Their arrival in a village wasn't feared, it was celebrated. Communities actively sought them out, asking for their blessings. They prayed for agricultural fertility, for healthy children, for protection from disease, and for reconciliation between warring families. In times of crisis, it was the Nri priests they turned to for guidance. And though they carried no swords, their authority was more powerful than any army. Elders from countless towns willingly accepted Nri's spiritual leadership. Why? Because it offered a system of justice and morality that everyone understood and respected. Families proudly traced their most important traditions back to Nri ceremonies. Ambitious chiefs and local rulers knew that their reign lacked true legitimacy until it was blessed by a Nri priest. This spiritual reach was so profound that even non-Igbo communities, people from different cultures and languages, acknowledged and respected Nri's sacred authority. At its peak, Nri's influence wasn't a bordered territory on a map, but a vast network of cultural and spiritual connection. It stretched across the lands that are now modern Anambra, parts of Enugu, and sections of Delta states, and its reach even extended into neighboring lands to the north. This is what made Nri so revolutionary. Other empires were built on coercion and conquest. You submitted to them out of fear, but Nri's empire was built on consent. People invited its involvement. They asked for its priests. They wanted to be part of its world. This didn't make Nri weak. It made it incredibly strong. It was a testament to the idea that spiritual power and cultural respect could create bonds far more binding than any chains or swords. It was a kingdom of peace, a civilization built on shared values. But as any student of history knows, nothing lasts forever. As Nri's influence grew, so did the challenges it faced. The delicate balance between ancient tradition and the pressures of a changing world is never easy to maintain. Just as Nri's elders had once shaped their world through ritual and belief, new forces began stirring beyond their sacred boundaries. Political pressures from rival states began to mount. Economic competitors emerged, challenging Nri's long-held control over trade and markets. And the tides of people power, the ambitions and desires of individuals and groups, began to shift in unpredictable ways. The kingdom was founded on peace, but the world around it would not remain peaceful forever. The stage was set for a new chapter in Nri's history, one where its most sacred principles would be put to the ultimate test. Other kingdoms built their legacy on battlefields. Nri built its influence through diplomacy, religion, and an intricate spiritual system. At the heart of this influence were the Nri priests, known as the Nri and the Dibia. Imagine this: instead of armies marching into a village, these priests would arrive, traveling far beyond the borders of their homeland. They didn't come to conquer. They came to cleanse communities of what were considered abominations, to settle bitter disputes between neighbors, and to install new, legitimate leaders. Their influence stretched across vast Igbo-speaking regions and even beyond, reaching places like Nsukka, Awka, and large parts of what we now know as Anambra and Enugu states. When these priests arrived, the people didn't greet them with fear, but with reverence. The priests carried sacred symbols, like the Ofo staff, a powerful symbol of truth and justice, and wore the Igi regalia, which marked them as holders of ancestral power. These weren't weapons of war. They were signs of peace and divine authority. Entire communities would voluntarily submit to Nri's spiritual leadership, not because they were forced, but because they sought protection, justice, and guidance. They believed Nri could restore balance to their world. This belief was the source of Nri's unique power. A community that refused Nri's cleansing rituals was thought to be inviting disaster. The land would become infertile, crops would fail, peace would vanish, and a deep spiritual confusion would fall upon the people. This wasn't a threat of military invasion. It was a threat of cosmic imbalance. Nri's power was rooted in the belief that they were guardians of the natural and spiritual order. This philosophy of peace was woven into the very fabric of their society. Children born into Nri families were strictly forbidden from ever seeing a corpse or spilling human blood. This profound pacifism set them apart from almost every other kingdom in history. They held a moral superiority that was respected and, in its own way, feared. You didn't fear Nri's armies because they had none. You feared the divine consequences of defying their spiritual authority. But no kingdom lasts forever, and the world outside of Nri was changing rapidly. New forces were gathering on the horizon. European traders arrived on the coast, bringing with them not just new goods, but new ideas and new ambitions. The dark shadow of the Atlantic slave trade began to fall across the region, creating an economy built on violence and human trafficking, the very opposite of everything Nri stood for. Internal disagreements and shifts in power also began to chip away at the old ways. The ultimate question loomed larger and larger. Could a kingdom built entirely on peace and spiritual authority survive in a world that was quickly spiraling into chaos and violence? How could a society that refused to spill blood defend itself against those who profited from it? The story of Nri's decline is as fascinating as its rise, a testament to a unique vision of power in a world that ultimately chose a different path. First came the traders, then the missionaries, and finally, the full force of the British Empire. The British couldn't understand Nri, a kingdom without a standing army, a ruler whose authority was purely spiritual. To them, it seemed ineffective, even primitive. They saw rituals and labeled them pagan. They saw a complex social system and dismissed it as disorganized. Driven by a desire for direct control and economic exploitation, the British colonial administration systematically dismantled the sacred systems that had held Nri together for centuries. They imposed their own rulers, known as warrant chiefs, who answered to the colonial government, not to the spiritual authority of the Nri. The priests were sidelined, their rituals were forbidden, and the sacred laws that had guided the Igbo people were broken. The very foundation of Nri's existence, its spiritual supremacy, was intentionally eroded. The communities that once looked to Nri for guidance and purification were forced to turn to new foreign masters. The great kingdom of peace began to fade into memory. But a story like Nri's doesn't simply disappear. Though its political power was broken, its spirit endured. It lived on in the hearts of the Igbo people, a powerful symbol of a time when leadership meant wisdom, not warfare. The memory of a kingdom that cleansed without killing and ruled without chains became a source of immense cultural pride. Even today, the OFO staff remains a potent symbol in Igbo culture, a reminder of justice, heritage, and the power that flows from peace. Nri's story whispers to us across time, a timeless lesson that true authority doesn't always need a sword. It reminds us that there are other ways to lead, other ways to build a society. By telling this story, we're not just looking back at history. We are honoring a vision of leadership the world desperately needs to remember. Thanks for watching. And if you found this story as fascinating as I did, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to join us on our next journey into the past.